All right. Our next question is from Peter. What do you make of Psalm 45:6, where the psalmist addresses the king as Elohim? Is this a sign that Israel's king, pre-resurrection and pre-glorification, was already considered part of the divine council? Of course, Hebrews 1 makes much of this verse and applying it to Christ. I'm curious how it might be understood in light of the divine council worldview.
Yeah, in real general terms, I would say that the trajectory that Peter mentions in the question about the king already, it's sort of an already not yet being considered part of the divine council. I would say that that's possible because believers are talked about in that way as well. It's just that you get some sort of possibly an explicit notation of it here in Psalm 45. Now, I want to take this in a different but related direction as well. On my website for the book, moreunseenrealm.com, if people go up to that and click on the tab or the chapter for chapter 4, I actually talk about this passage on that website. And so I want to read a little bit of what's on the website. And this is going to be a little tough to translate to people in audio form. So I would recommend, if you are listening to this and you can pull out a Bible and be looking at Psalm 45 here, it might help, because it's going to be a little hard to follow, perhaps. But you can always go up and read this later, because I'm just going to read what I have at More Unseen Realm, chapter 4, part of that page here. So the question presumes that the psalmist's statement, and this is typically the way it's translated, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever." The question presumes that the psalmist's statement must refer to the Israelite king, and refer to the Israelite king in that way. In other words, addressing the Israelite king and actually saying, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever." So that's the presumption behind the question. Now, some will take that presumption and then argue that Elohim refers to humans, and then they try to get the gods out of Psalm 82 and lots of other passages. Of course, the problem with that is, even if it's true that the psalmist is referring to the king as Elohim, it's the king. It's not the Israelite judges, and it's not every human. So let's say that it's an illogical argument to use this verse against there being gods, divine beings, in the divine council in Psalm 82. And of course, then you have also the problem of Psalm 89, the councils in heaven, and so on. This doesn't help. This doesn't help demythologize Psalm 82, even though some people try to. And basically, their arguments are only effective for people who are listening to them and not thinking. It's just a bad argument. Now, where I'm going to take this here, and again, just go to moreunseenrealm.com. There are those who say, well, that's really not the way Psalm 45, verse 6 should be translated. Golden Gay. Okay, I'll just start reading here. Although it seems little known, the original orientation of Elohim in Psalm 45, 6 and 7 could coherently be God himself. This is possible depending on how one takes the stanzas in the psalm, also called kola, the plural of colons that scholars speak for stanza. I use the word stanza because I think more people can identify with that. Poetic stanza, poetic line. So depending on how you take the stanzas, how you divide them up, and what belongs with what, you actually come out a different place where the language is referring to God himself and not the king. That's possible. Golden Gay, who is an evangelical Old Testament scholar, he's written a lot of stuff, frankly, in his commentary on Psalms, which is multi-volume, but he says of this psalm at this point, he notes the structure of the psalm statement, and he actually renders verse 5 and the first part of verse 6 this way. Now listen. Your arrows are sharpened, peoples are beneath your feet. They fall in the heart of the king's armies. The throne, God's, G-O-D apostrophe S, the throne, which is God's throne, is yours forever and ever. So speaking to the king, but speaking about God himself, not calling the king God. That is a perfectly legitimate translation of Psalm 46, verse 5, and the first part of verse 6. Golden Gay then offers some comment, for his translation here. He says, as the king acts in the pursuit of truthfulness and faithfulness, expecting to see God doing marvels, then opponents will fall before him. On any reading, the order of the kola, these stanzas, is jerky. Many English versions reverse some of the phrases to make the text read more smoothly. Aha! Verse 5 is yet another pair of four stress kola. What he means by that, this is me interjecting now. What he means by that is you have a poetic line and there's an accenting system that the Masoretes apply, not just in poetry. They have an accentual system throughout the Hebrew Bible, but the accenting system for poetry helps divide up the kola, the stanzas, and for the translator, at least the Masoretes are showing this is how we would group things here by virtue of this accenting system. So Golden Gay says, verse 5 is another pair of four stress kola. There's four accents in the kola, with the second clause in verse 5a forming a parenthesis. The they refers to the arrows. The declaration in verse 6, the first part, 6a, then closes off these comments about the king's power. His victories reflect the fact that he sits on God's throne. And he has a cross-reference here, 1 Chronicles 29, verse 23. Solomon sat on the throne of the Lord as king in place of David his father. So the king sits on God's throne, ruling Israel on God's behalf, and is destined to rule the world on God's behalf, Psalm 2. That in itself would make the king's throne last forever. The fact that God made a lasting commitment to the Davidic king's throne would also have that implication. So what he's saying here is he's saying, look, the translation that he offers makes sense, both in terms of the Masoretic markup and theologically. I'll read it again to you. This is how Golden Gate translates it. Your arrows are sharpened. Peoples are beneath your feet. They fall, the arrows, fall in the heart of the king's enemies. The throne, God's throne, is yours forever and ever. Again, what Golden Gate would say is this is a reference to the promise to David. And he's not calling the king God. He's saying the king sits on God's throne. So if you take it that way, then the question, again, is really both answered and kind of done away with. But what prompts the question, of course, is typically the way English Bibles, many of them, and Golden Gay, this is Golden Gay's language, this isn't mine. English translations will rearrange some things to make it sound smoother, and you come out with your throne, O God, is forever and ever. And that generates this question of why is the king being called God? Well, the answer is, the Hebrew text might not have meant that at all, and probably didn't. Again, I'm with Golden Gay on this. I think it makes a lot of sense what he's saying. So I needed to read through that rather than just saying, well, that's just not the way it's translated, and I like this other one. There's really good reasoning behind it to link it to the Davidic covenant and also to take the stanzas for what they are within the Masoretic tradition of accenting and grouping them. You don't have the king called God in that case.